Picture this. It's September 15th, 1940. London is burning. Above the city, nearly 2,000 aircraft fill the sky in the largest aerial battle the world has ever seen. A young RAF pilot, barely 20 years old, has already flown 3 missions today. His hands shake from exhaustion, his Spitfire is riddled with bullet holes, and he's down to his last few rounds of ammunition. But the German bombers just keep coming. He knows that if he turns back now, if he and his fellow pilots fail today, Britain will fall. Hitler will invade. The Nazis will win the war. Everything depends on what happens in the next few hours, thousands of feet above the English countryside. This is the Battle of Britain, and today we're going to explore how a small group of exhausted pilots flying outdated aircraft managed to achieve the impossible. They stopped the most powerful military machine in history and changed the course of World War II forever. This is the story of courage, innovation, and the fight for survival that played out in the skies above Britain during the summer and fall of 1940. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler had conquered most of Europe. Poland had fallen in weeks. Denmark and Norway were under Nazi control. France, the mighty military power that had held Germany at bay for 4 years in World War I, had surrendered after just 6 weeks of fighting. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving behind all their heavy equipment. Hitler stood at the French coast, looking across the English Channel at the white cliffs of Dover, just 21 miles away. Britain stood alone. The United States hadn't entered the war. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. Every other European nation was either conquered, neutral, or allied with the Nazis. Winston Churchill had just become Prime Minister, but his generals told him Britain had no chance. The country had fewer than 700 fighter planes. Many were outdated models. The pilots were undertrained. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was the most powerful in the world, with over 2,800 aircraft and pilots who had been battle-hardened in Poland, France, and Spain. Hitler issued Directive No. 16, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain. But there was a problem. The German army couldn't just march across the English Channel. They needed ships, and those ships would be vulnerable to the Royal Navy, which was still the largest in the world. So Hitler made a fateful decision. Before the invasion could happen, the Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force and achieve total air superiority over Britain. Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest allies, promised he could crush the RAF in just 4 days. He was wrong, and his mistake would cost Germany the war. The stage was set for a battle unlike any in history. For the first time, the outcome of a war would be decided entirely in the air. There would be no trenches, no ground battles, no naval engagements, just planes, pilots, and the sky. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and if the RAF lost, Hitler's armies would land on British beaches within weeks. The Royal Air Force faced impossible odds, but they had 3 critical advantages that would make all the difference: brilliant technology, strategic genius, and pilots who were willing to die for their country. Let's start with the technology. Britain had 2 fighter aircraft that would become legendary: the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. The Hurricane was the workhorse, sturdy and reliable, easier to repair than the Spitfire. It shot down more German aircraft than any other fighter during the battle, but it was the Spitfire that captured the public imagination. With its elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Spitfire could match the German Bf 109 fighters in speed and maneuverability. It was beautiful, deadly, and it gave British pilots a fighting chance. But the real technological advantage wasn't the planes themselves. It was radar. Britain had developed a chain of radar stations along its coast called Chain Home. This was revolutionary technology that could detect incoming German aircraft up to 100 miles away. The Germans knew Britain had radar, but they completely underestimated its importance. This early warning system meant RAF fighters didn't have to constantly patrol the skies, wasting fuel and exhausting pilots. Instead, they could wait on the ground until radar detected incoming raids, then scramble to intercept. This force multiplication was crucial because Britain had so few fighters. The strategic genius came from Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding was a difficult, prickly character who many of his colleagues disliked, but he was a tactical mastermind. He divided Britain into groups and sectors, each with its own airfields and control centers. He created an integrated system where radar operators, spotters on the ground, and radio controllers would guide fighters to intercept German formations. When German planes crossed the channel, Dowding knew exactly where they were, how many there were, and could position his fighters perfectly. The Germans were fighting blind. The British could see everything. Then there were the pilots themselves. The few, as Churchill would call them. Most were British, but they came from all over the world. There were Polish pilots who had escaped when their country fell, flying with a fury born of vengeance. Czechoslovakian pilots, New Zealanders, Canadians, Australians, South Africans, even a few Americans who volunteered before their country entered the war. Many were teenagers, some barely out of school. They were given a few weeks of training and then thrown into combat against experienced Luftwaffe pilots who had been fighting for years. The pressure on these young men was unimaginable. They flew multiple missions every day. Many pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties in a single day during the height of the battle. They watched their friends die. They saw aircraft explode, pilots bail out with their parachutes on fire, planes plummet into the English countryside, and then they landed, grabbed a quick meal, and went back up again. The psychological toll was enormous. Many developed what we'd now call PTSD. Some had nervous breakdowns. But they kept flying because they knew what was at stake. On August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, the operation to destroy the RAF. Göring was confident. He had numerical superiority, better trained pilots, and the combat experience of conquering most of Europe. His plan was simple: attack RAF airfields, destroy British planes on the ground and in the air, and achieve air supremacy within a few weeks. The first attacks focused on radar stations and coastal airfields. German bombers, escorted by fighters, came in massive formations, sometimes hundreds of aircraft at once. The sound was terrifying for people on the ground. The drone of hundreds of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the explosions of bombs. But the RAF rose to meet them, and the German pilots were shocked by the ferocity of the resistance. The tactics evolved rapidly. German fighters had more fuel and could reach higher altitudes than British planes, but the Spitfires and Hurricanes were more maneuverable. RAF pilots developed the big wing formation, where multiple squadrons would group together to attack German formations. The Germans flew in tight formations for mutual protection, but this made them less flexible. RAF pilots learned to attack from out of the sun, diving at high speed, firing a burst, and then breaking away before the German fighters could respond. Every day brought massive air battles. On August 15th, the Luftwaffe launched its largest operation yet, attacking from bases in Norway, Denmark, France, and Belgium simultaneously. They sent over 2,000 sorties, trying to overwhelm the RAF. The fighting was intense. That single day saw 75 German aircraft shot down at the cost of 34 British fighters. But crucially, the RAF could replace their losses. Britain's aircraft factories were working around the clock, producing new Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than Germany could destroy them. The German pilots began to realize this wasn't going to be easy. They were facing an enemy who wouldn't quit, who kept coming back no matter how many planes they lost. The RAF pilots were younger and less experienced, but they were defending their homeland. They were fighting over friendly territory, which meant if they bailed out, they could be back in the air the next day. German pilots who parachuted over Britain became prisoners of war, but Göring kept up the pressure. Throughout August, the Luftwaffe pounded RAF airfields. Runways were cratered with bombs, hangars were destroyed, control centers were hit. The strain on the RAF was showing. Pilot fatigue became critical. Some squadrons were reduced to just a handful of operational aircraft. Dowding was rotating squadrons, pulling exhausted units out of the front lines and replacing them with fresh pilots. But he was running out of reserves. By early September, Fighter Command was on the brink of collapse. If the Germans had kept up their attacks on airfields for just a few more weeks, they might have won. Then Hitler made a catastrophic mistake. On August 24, 1940, a small group of German bombers got lost in the dark and accidentally dropped their bombs on central London instead of their assigned military targets. Churchill was furious and immediately ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. It was mostly symbolic. The British bombers did little damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. Berlin had been bombed. Hitler had promised the German people that enemy aircraft would never reach the Reich capital. He was humiliated and absolutely enraged. Against the advice of his military commanders, Hitler ordered a change in strategy. Instead of continuing to attack RAF airfields, the Luftwaffe would now focus on bombing London and other British cities. The goal was to break British morale, to terrorize the civilian population into demanding peace. Göring thought it was a brilliant idea. He could bomb Britain into submission while also drawing out the remaining RAF fighters to be destroyed in massive air battles over the cities. This decision saved the Royal Air Force. Just when fighter command was at its weakest, when a few more weeks of attacks on airfields might have finished them off, the Germans switched targets. The damaged airfields could be repaired. New aircraft could be delivered. Exhausted pilots got a brief respite. Dowding couldn't believe his luck. On September 7, 1940, the Blitz began. Over 300 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, attacked London in broad daylight. The docks were set ablaze. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Over 400 civilians were killed on that first day. And the Germans came back that night with another raid, and the night after that, and the night after that. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers attacked London. The scenes in London were apocalyptic. Families huddled in underground stations, using subway platforms as bomb shelters. Entire streets were reduced to rubble. Fires raged out of control. St. Paul's Cathedral stood surrounded by flames, becoming an iconic symbol of British resistance. The casualties were horrific. By the end of the Blitz, over 40,000 civilians would be dead, with another 46,000 injured. But the British didn't break. If anything, the bombing strengthened their resolve. Churchill walked through the bombed neighborhoods and people cheered him. The attitude was defiant. London can take it. Meanwhile, the RAF continued to extract a heavy toll on German bombers. Night fighters and anti-aircraft guns made the raids increasingly costly. The Luftwaffe was losing bombers faster than they could replace them. September 15, 1940, would later be designated Battle of Britain Day, the moment when the tide definitively turned. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London, determined to finally break British resistance and destroy the RAF once and for all. The day started early. Radar detected a huge formation assembling over France. As German bombers and fighters crossed the Channel, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group which defended London, made a crucial decision. Instead of holding back reserves, he threw everything he had at the Germans. Every available squadron was scrambled. The first wave hit at midday. The sky over London filled with aircraft. Contrails crisscrossed the blue September sky as hundreds of planes wheeled and fought. On the ground, thousands of Londoners came out of their shelters and watched the battle overhead. They could see parachutes deploying as pilots bailed out, aircraft trailing smoke and fire, dogfights swirling thousands of feet above them. The RAF pilots were magnificent that day. Polish Squadron 303, famous for their aggressive tactics and their hatred of the Germans, tore into the bomber formations. Hurricanes attacked the bombers while Spitfires engaged the German fighter escorts. The German formations broke apart under the assault. Many bombers jettisoned their loads early and turned for home. Very few reached their targets. Then came the second wave in the afternoon. Again, Park scrambled every available fighter. The Germans couldn't believe it. Where were all these British planes coming from? Göring had assured his pilots that the RAF was down to its last few squadrons, nearly defeated. Yet here they were again, just as numerous, just as aggressive as ever. The truth was devastating for German morale. All their losses, all their sacrifices over the past month, had achieved nothing. The RAF was still in the fight. By the end of September 15th, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft, the RAF only 26. More importantly, the Germans realized they couldn't win. They didn't have air superiority. The RAF wasn't beaten. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was impossible without control of the skies. 2 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed the invasion. He would never attempt it again. The Battle of Britain wasn't technically over. The Luftwaffe continued daylight raids through September and into October. The night bombing of the Blitz would continue until May 1941. But the critical moment had passed. Britain had survived. The RAF had won. The Battle of Britain was the first major defeat of Nazi Germany and a crucial turning point in World War II. If Britain had fallen in 1940, the war would have been over. With all of Europe under Nazi control and no base from which to launch a counterattack, the United States almost certainly wouldn't have entered the European war. Hitler would have been free to turn all his attention to the Soviet Union. The Holocaust would have proceeded without any opposition. The world we live in today would be unrecognizably different and infinitely darker. The victory came at enormous cost. The RAF lost 1,542 aircrew killed, over 500 wounded. Of the few, the 2,936 pilots and aircrew who flew in the battle, 1 in 5 didn't survive. Many more were horribly burned or wounded. Over 40,000 British civilians died in the bombing. Entire neighborhoods in London, Coventry, and other cities were destroyed. But Britain survived, and that survival made everything else possible. It provided a base for American forces when they entered the war. It became the launching point for the D-Day invasion. It kept hope alive for occupied Europe. The Battle of Britain proved that the Nazis could be beaten, that their military wasn't invincible, that resistance was possible. Churchill famously said of the RAF pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was right. A few thousand young men, many barely out of their teens, held back the Nazi tide when Britain stood alone. They fought when the odds were impossible. They kept flying when every instinct told them to run. They sacrificed everything, and they saved the world. The technology of the battle, especially radar and coordinated air defense systems, revolutionized military thinking. The courage of the pilots inspired generations. The proof that a smaller, determined force could defeat a larger, more powerful enemy through superior tactics, technology, and sheer willpower became a template studied by military strategists worldwide. When we look back at the pivotal moments of World War II, we think of D-Day, the Battle of Stalingrad, the atomic bombs. But none of those would have been possible without the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, in the skies above England, the fate of the world hung in the balance, and a small group of brave pilots made the difference. That's the story of the Battle of Britain, the story of how the RAF defended the skies and changed history forever. Remember their sacrifice, remember what they saved, and remember that sometimes, even when the odds are impossible, courage and determination can achieve the unthinkable.